This is the solution to exercise 5D. In this part of the exercise, we're going to be adding the REST API and then deploying the application to Bluemix. To start with, we need to create a new file to host the Node.js server. So new file, and this is going to be called server.js. In the package.json, when we first created the project, this is the file that we're actually going to launch when we start the application. And then what we need to do is just copy the code that's in the exercise notes. And this is a very basic Node.js server implementation using the Express framework. And here you can see we're going to create a new server. It'll listen on port 3000 and it will log when it starts to listen. So I just save that file. And you'll see that the first thing that it does is it uses the Express framework. So we need to come into a command window, leave mucker if it's still running, and then we need to do npm install Express. And then we just use save. We don't do save dev because Express is a dependency that we need at production time, not just during development. So we just say save, and that will install that dependency and write it into the package.json file. So we're finished there. Click on the name and F5 to bring it into Eclipse. So now that we've got our basic server, we need to implement the API for the FizzBuzz. So again, we can copy and paste the code that is in the example just to add the implementation. So we're going to bring in our implementation of the FizzBuzz algorithm, and then the app-get creates me a new endpoint within my server. So when I type FizzBuzz range, it's going to implement this endpoint. I'm going to extract the parameters from the URL, and then the result I'm going to send back is a JSON document with a from, a to, and then the result, and I'm going to call my convert range to FizzBuzz function to get that result back. So that is the server implemented. And to test this, we can actually run it within Eclipse. Again, I'm going to use the npm start command, and then here you can see that we have our server listening on port 3000. So if I bring up a browser and then come into localhost port 3000, I don't have an index, so I need to go straight into the function FizzBuzz range, and then we go from 1 to 20. I just love. And because Internet Explorer can't actually handle that, I'm going to bring this up in Chrome. And there we see it. So to test this, we need to launch a browser. I'm actually going to use Chrome here because it will display a JSON document. By default, Internet Explorer will not. It'll ask you to save the file. So I'm just bringing up Chrome. I type in my URL, localhost 3000, the endpoint fizzbuzz range, and we're going to ask for the range from 1 to 20. Hit enter, and there we go. I've got my JSON document back with the from, the to, and the result key value pairs. So that's the application running locally. What I want to do now is get it running on Bluemix. So I'm just going to Control C to stop the server running. And then if you look at the code, there's a couple of things that we need to change. When you deploy an application to Bluemix, you need to ensure that you listen on the port that Bluemix tells you to listen on. So what we need to do is we need to change these two lines of code, and we need to use the environment variables vcap app port and vcap app host. And what that will do is when it runs on Bluemix, it'll be listening on the right host and port name. The code that I've provided will also allow it to keep working in local, because if these environment variables do not exist, it'll default to the local values. So when I'm running on Bluemix, I'll use the environment variables, and when I'm running locally, I'll use the local options. And then what we have to do is we need to create a new manifest file. So right click, new file, and we're going to create manifest.yml. I'm going to call this the name is the only item that you have to provide in a manifest file. All the other entries are optional. So we just save that. And then if we look at what we've got in the navigator, there are a number of things that I actually don't want to send to Bluemix. So the next file we're going to create is right click, new file. We're going to create the .cfignore. And this is going to stop certain files being sent to Bluemix. So we've added a number of entries, and when we do a cf push, these directories and files will not be sent to Bluemix. So again, we save that file. And then the last thing we want to do is we just want to modify the .gitignore. And again, I'm going to add the npm debug log if it exists. And then these launch configurations are files that are created when I send something to DevOps services so it can deploy to Bluemix. And again, I don't want those going into Git. So there are all the changes we need. So what we need to do now is just make sure all of these files are sent to our DevOps Services Git repository. So we stage them. So we can now verify that there are no outstanding changes. All of this code is now in our DevOps Services project. So we can now shrink Eclipse and launch our DevOps Services. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into the build and deploy. So when we had a boilerplate, we automatically got a deployment pipeline. But here we're going to set it up from scratch. So the first thing we do is we add a stage. Shrink that down, and we're going to call this stage build. As input, we're going to use the source code repository, and that should be pre-defined to our repository. And then just check that automatically execute job when a change is pushed to Git. So that means whenever a new change is pushed to Git, will automatically build. Under the jobs tab, we're going to add a job, and we're going to add a build. And the build type we want, or we're going to use here, is a shell script. And what I'm going to do is just type npm install npm. And then I'm going to use that just to run the install and pull all the dependencies that have been written into our package.json file. The npm install npm will make sure that we have the very, very latest version of npm, and then we're going to run that recently installed version of npm to actually do the install. And what we want to do is stop the execution on job failure. So if this fails, we don't want anything else to be executed. And I just save. And that's the build stage. What I want to do next is click Add Stage. And we want to run our tests. We don't want anything to be deployed if our tests don't run. So the input type is build artifacts. And the stage is a previously defined stage called build. And the output is from the job called build. So that's going to take what was created in the previous step, and we're going to run this when the previous stage completes successfully. So then on the jobs, we're going to add a job, and it is going to be a test job. The tester type is simple, and the script we are going to run is And again, we want to stop the stage if execution fails. And then we save that. And if our build in our test fails, sorry, if our build in our test works, we want to then deploy it. So we add a stage and we call this deploy. Again, we're going to use the build artifacts and we want to automatically trigger it. And for the jobs, we're adding a deploy job. The deployer type is Cloud Foundry, and we're going to put it to our correct region, organization, and space, and then give it the application name that we want. And if you remember in Eclipse, in the manifest file, you should have defined the name that you want for your application, so you can use that name. Just make sure I get that correct. And then the deploy script, we can actually leave as done. If you want to actually view the logs as part of the deploy command, so it actually gets printed out in the log, you can actually uncomment this line, but we're going to leave it as default. And then I simply save. So now we've actually defined our pipeline. So what we can do is we can start it manually. So I just click on the build. And we should watch that go through run. We should then see the tests go through and run. And if everything works as expected, we should then see the deploy go through and run. As before, if you want to have a look at the logs, you can just click. And there you can see the log that was output by the test. And we pass all 9 tests. And then simply go back to the pipeline. So there we go. We've now successfully built, tested, and deployed our application. So now we can run it. And I'm going to run this in Chrome again. So I'm just going to copy, launch Chrome, and then paste. And then we want to put the range in. So I'm going to go from 1 to 50. Obviously, I've got to put the endpoint in, which is FizzBuzz range. That's better. So now you can see I've got results from 1 to 50 coming through with the FizzBuzz. But at the end of the last solution, I did mention that there is actually still a bug in the code. So what happens if we test different ranges? For example, if I were to test, instead of 1 to 50, 9 to 50, and you see I get no results. And this is down to a common error with typed or weakly typed languages. When you're doing comparison, you need to be very clear whether you're comparing a number or a string. So if I'm comparing numbers, 9 is less than 50. But if I'm comparing strings, the string with the number 9 would actually be sorted after a string containing 50, because 9 is greater than 5. So if we go back and look at our code, then we do have a bit of a problem. Because if I come into FizzBuzz and look at the method, we're actually passing strings into here. So this comparison is actually doing a string comparison of, in this case, start is 9 and end is 50. So we're doing a string comparison, is 9 less than or equal to 50, and that returns false. So we immediately jump out and return no results. So if we go back and look at our tests, we find that we've actually implemented our tests incorrectly. Because when I'm testing the ranges, I'm inputting numbers rather than strings. So if I were, for example, to change this to 9 to 50, then I would actually fail the test. And we can actually do that. And this is one of the things I put in the lecture notes, that you've got to be sure that you're actually testing and including common known errors. So if I put that and then go and run my tests, if I save this file now, you'll see that we're now failing. So the way to fix this is just to force this to be a number. And we can do that by simply saying and then instead of start and end, if we use from and to, we're now doing number comparison.